In March of 1889, the Chinook wind rolled down from the Cabinet Mountains into Stoneberry Hollow, nearly 2 weeks earlier than the old settlers had ever seen. Not warm at first, just warm enough to soften the top crust of snow along the southern slopes. Warm enough to make pine branches shed their loads in sudden heavy thumps. Warm enough that water began running unseen beneath the river ice, while the surface still looked frozen solid enough to drive a wagon across. Caleb Thorne stood at the lower edge of his dry stone wall at dawn, watching steam rise from the dark patches of earth bleeding through the snow along the south-facing curve of the hillside. The wall ran nearly 400 yards along the upper bend above Stoneberry Hollow, shoulder-high in most places, taller where the slope steepened toward the river. Beside him, an old gray and black mountain hound named Roper stood with his head low and his ears pulled tight against his skull, refusing to step any closer to the riverbed below. The dog had not stopped packing since the wind shifted 3 nights earlier. Caleb noticed that before he noticed the dripping. Water was running underneath the boardwalk back in the village, weeks ahead of when any spring melt had any business arriving. People gathered after services that Sunday when Caleb tried, one last time, to warn them. He spoke the way he always spoke, plainly, without much weight. Move the wagons off the river flat. Brace the storehouse against the upper bank. Take the children up to the bench above Garner's mill before the next warm night came down off the mountains. Reverend Silas Burnham would not let him finish. The preacher stood up from the front pew and called the wall above Caleb's cabin a monument to pride, a heap of stone built by a man who had spent too many winters alone to remember the difference between fearing God and fearing weather. The crowd murmured behind him. A few men laughed. Hetty Marsh, the widow who ran Stoneberry's general store and held most of the credit notes in the valley, did not raise her voice. She simply said the store could not extend any more lines to a man whose name had begun spreading bad feelings through paying customers. That night, the town council voted. By morning, Caleb was told to take his hound, his tools, and the contents of his cabin and be off the valley road before the second bell. The door of the meeting house closed behind him after midnight with a hard, cold sound that carried clean across the frozen square. Caleb stood there a long moment, holding an oilcloth bundle beneath one arm, his Uncle Owen Thorne's stonework journal, a folded plat map of the river bend, an iron mason's hammer with a worn ash handle. Roper stood beside him, facing east toward the wall on the hillside. The dog never once looked back at the lit windows of Stoneberry Hollow. Years earlier, before Stoneberry began calling him a stubborn fool, Caleb had learned stone from his Uncle Owen, a Cornish dry stone mason who had drifted west building rail cuts and miners' walls before settling near the headwaters of the Clark Fork. Owen trusted weight more than mortar. He taught Caleb to study the lean of every hillside, the pattern of old high-water marks left on the trunks of alders, the way moss grew thicker on the north faces of standing boulders, the soft hollow sound certain soils made beneath the heel of a boot in late winter. Every observation went into a leather-bound journal kept dry inside a small tin chest. "Stone forgives slow," Owen used to say. "Water forgives nothing." One autumn, he led young Caleb to a low bend along a creek south of Thompson Falls and pressed the boy's palm flat against a layer of pale silt half buried beneath the willows. "This is where the water came 2 springs ago when nobody was watching. It will come here again." A year later, the creek did exactly that, taking out a corral and 3 outbuildings precisely where Owen had pointed. So when Caleb arrived in Stoneberry Hollow in the spring of 1881 and walked the curve above the river for the first time, he had already read the slope, the bend, and the silt long before he ever laid the first stone of the wall. The wall had taken Caleb Thorne nearly 4 full summers to build. He started it the year his Uncle Owen died from a chest cold caught while repairing a stock fence in a freezing rain near Plains. Caleb buried the old man on the bench above the river and began moving stone the same week, the way other grieving men might have started drinking or wandering. He worked the wall alone in the long evenings after his trap lines, hauling flat sandstone slabs from a broken seam farther up the ridge, fitting each piece by hand without a single dab of mortar between them. People in Stoneberry Hollow noticed him within the first month. At first, they were curious. A few of the older Cornish miners who had drifted into the valley after the silver played out near granite came up to watch him work, nodding quietly at the way he set each stone with its heavy face down and its tail pressed deep into the slope. They knew dry stone work when they saw it. Two of them even helped him for a week without asking for pay. But Caleb did not build the wall the way most men would have. He did not run it along the property line below his cabin. He did not run it as a windbreak around his small kitchen garden. Instead, he ran it across the open hillside above the village, following a curve that meant nothing to anybody looking at it from the road. The wall began near a clump of black willows above Garner's mill, bent down through a shallow swale, climbed back up across a patch of pale silty ground where nothing much grew, and ended at a square of older, half-buried stonework that nobody in Stoneberry could remember being placed. That was the part that made people uneasy. The wall did not seem to be protecting anything. It did not seem to be holding anything back. It simply curved across the slope like a long, low scar, 400 yards of carefully fitted stone serving no purpose any reasonable man could explain. By the third summer, the talk had started turning. Reverend Silas Burnham, newly arrived from a struggling congregation in eastern Oregon, gave a sermon about idols built from the works of men's hands. He never named Caleb directly. He never had to. By the fourth summer, the children of Stoneberry had begun calling it the Fool's Wall, and the name stuck the way names always stick to things their builders cannot defend in public. Caleb never defended it. He simply kept building. When the last stone was set in the autumn of 1884, he walked back down to the village, paid off his small accounts at Hetty Marsh's store, and went on with his trapping the way he had before. He never invited anyone up to look at the finished work. He never explained the curve or the swale or the patch of pale silt the wall crossed. He never opened Owen Thorne's journal in front of another living soul. Hetty Marsh asked him once, in the spring of 1886, what the wall was for. The two of them were standing on the boardwalk outside her store while a slow rain dripped from the eaves. Caleb looked at her for a long moment before he answered. "It's for a day the village hasn't seen yet," he said. Hetty did not ask again. But she told the story to 2 or 3 other women that same week, and within a month half the valley had heard some version of it, and most of those versions made Caleb sound stranger than he was. By the autumn of 1888, the talk had become something colder than mockery. The wall had begun to bother people in a way they could not quite put into words. It sat up there on the slope above Stoneberry Hollow through every storm, every thaw, every hard winter wind, and it never shifted, never sagged, never lost a single stone from its top course. Some of the newer settlers, the ones who had arrived after the wall was already finished, began saying it had been there before the village. A few of them began avoiding the upper road that ran beneath it on their way to the high pasture. That was the ground Caleb Thorne was standing on when the Chinook came down off the cabinets 2 weeks early, and he tried, one last time, to make Stoneberry Hollow listen. Caleb Thorne left Stoneberry Hollow before second bell with Roper trotting at his heel along the upper wagon road. He did not take the lower trail past the village square. He took the long way around, climbing the bench above Garner's mill in the dark, then cutting north along the timbered slope until the lights of the settlement disappeared behind the shoulder of the hill. The Chinook had not yet returned, but the air carried that same wrong softness underneath the cold, the kind of softness that does not belong in a Montana March. He stopped once near the top of the bench, set the oilcloth bundle down on a flat rock, and looked back across the valley. From that height, Stoneberry Hollow looked the way it always looked at night, a scatter of lantern-lit windows, the white square of the meeting house, the dark line of the river curving past the lower flats where most of the wagons and outbuildings sat. The river ice still held. The flats still looked solid. The storehouse still squatted at the foot of the upper bank exactly where Hetty Marsh's late husband had placed it 20 years earlier, Before anyone in the valley had thought to ask why the ground there stayed pale and silty even in the driest summers, Caleb stood looking at it for a long time. Roper sat beside him, leaning his shoulder against Caleb's leg the way the dog always did when the wind shifted wrong. 2 nights, Caleb said quietly. Maybe 3. The dog did not answer. He did not need to. By dawn, Caleb had reached the cabin his Uncle Owen had built 30 years earlier, half a mile back into the timber above the wall. The place was small, one room with a stone hearth set into the north wall, and a sleeping loft above. Owen had chosen the site for the way the slope behind it broke the prevailing wind, and for the spring that came up clean and cold from beneath a slab of gray limestone 20 paces from the door. Caleb had not lived there in years. He kept it stocked and dry, the way a man keeps a second place ready without quite admitting to himself why. He built up a small fire, set water to boil, and opened Owen Thorne's journal on the rough table beside the hearth. The journal was nearly 40 years old by then. The leather had darkened to almost black along the spine. The pages inside were soft from handling and crowded with Owen's careful, slanted writing, observations about soils, about freshets, about the way certain hillsides settled after wet winters. Most of it was practical. Some of it was almost tender, the way an old man writes about things he has spent his life watching. Caleb turned to the section he had read more times than any other. It was dated June of 1859, almost 30 years before the Chinook that was now creeping back down out of the cabinets. Owen had been working a stone fence for a rancher named Garner on the north bend of what would later become Stoneberry Hollow. The entry described the lay of the land in careful detail, the curve of the river, the slope above the flats, the patch of pale, silty ground that ran in a long crescent across the hillside. Owen had walked that crescent on foot, marking it with a pocket compass and a length of wax string. "This is the old line," he had written. "The river took this ground once and will take it again. Garner does not believe me. He has built his mill below the line. He has built his house above it, which is the only thing he has done right." Below that entry, in slightly different ink, Owen had added a second note years later. "Stoneberry Hollow now sits across the line. The storehouse, the wagon flats, the lower road, and 3 of the new cabins are inside it. I have told the council twice. They will not hear it from a Cornishman with a hammer. If Caleb ever reads this, he will know what to do." Caleb closed the journal slowly. Outside, the wind had shifted again. He could hear it moving high in the pines above the cabin, that same soft, warm undertone running beneath the cold like a second voice. Roper lifted his head from beside the hearth and looked at the door. "I know," Caleb said. "I hear it." The first warm night came down off the cabinets 2 days after Caleb reached the old cabin. He felt it before he saw it. He woke in the dark sometime past midnight to the sound of water dripping steadily from the eaves above the door, and to Roper standing in the middle of the room with his head turned toward the south wall. The fire had burned down to coals. The air inside the cabin smelled faintly of wet earth, the way it does in April when the ground first begins to give. Caleb pulled on his coat and his boots and stepped outside without lighting the lantern. The sky above the timber was clear and the stars were sharp, but the wind was wrong. It came up the slope from the south in slow, heavy pushes, carrying that soft, almost humid warmth that has no place in a Montana late winter. The snow along the south face of the cabin had already begun to slump. A thin trickle of meltwater was running down the path toward the spring. He walked out past the woodpile to where the timber opened up and gave him a view of the valley. The lights of Stoneberry Hollow were still burning down on the flats. From this height he could see the dark line of the river curving past the storehouse, and the long pale curve of the wall further up the slope, catching faint starlight along its top course. Everything still looked the way it always looked. The river ice still held. The flats still looked solid, but Caleb had spent enough nights on this hillside with his Uncle Owen to know what the warm wind was doing under the snow. It was working down. It was finding the old ice along the upper river, the ice that had built up against the bend above Garner's mill all through January and February. It was loosening the grip of that ice against the bank, one slow degree at a time. And underneath the river ice itself, the spring water from the lower springs would already be running freer than it had run in months, eating at the underside of the frozen surface, hollowing it out from below while the top still looked thick enough to trust. 2 nights of this, maybe 3. Then the river would move, and when it moved, it would not move along the channel it had cut through the winter. It would take the easier path. It would take the old path. It would take the long crescent of pale, silty ground that ran across the lower flats of Stoneberry Hollow, exactly where Owen Thorne had walked it with a pocket compass and a length of wax string 30 years earlier. Caleb stood there in the dark a long time. Roper sat beside him without moving. Somewhere down on the flats, a dog barked once and then went quiet. He thought about walking back down. He thought about hammering on Hetty Marsh's door, on Reverend Silas Burnham's door, on the doors of the men who had voted him out of the valley 4 days earlier. He thought about standing in the middle of the village square and shouting until somebody listened. He had thought about all of it before, more than once, during the long evenings of the past winter when the talk against him had begun to harden. He had decided then, and he decided again now standing in the dark above the cabin, that it would not work. Stoneberry Hollow had spent 4 years building a story about him, and that story did not have room in it for the truth he was carrying. If he walked back down there in the middle of the night and tried to move them off the flats, half of them would refuse out of stubbornness, and the other half would refuse because Reverend Burnham would tell them to. Maybe a few would come, not enough. He turned and walked back to the cabin. Roper followed him without a sound. Inside, he built the fire back up and pulled the oilcloth bundle out from where he had set it on the shelf above the hearth. He unwrapped it slowly on the table. The journal, the folded plat map, the iron mason's hammer with the worn ash handle. He set the hammer down beside the map and opened the map flat under the lantern light. The crescent was drawn on it in Owen's careful hand, a long pale curve sweeping across the lower flats of what was now Stoneberry Hollow. Caleb traced it once with his finger, from the willows above Garner's mill down through the swale, across the silty patch, and back up to the half-buried square of older stonework that nobody in the village could remember being placed. Then he traced the line of the wall above it. The 2 curves matched almost exactly. The wall sat directly above the crescent, 400 yards of carefully fitted dry stone running across the hillside in the same long sweep as the old path of the river. Caleb sat looking at the map for a long time. Then he folded it back up, wrapped it in the oilcloth, and went to find his shovel. He worked through the rest of that night and most of the next day. The wall itself did not need any more building. It had been finished for nearly 5 years, and Caleb had walked its full length twice a season ever since, resetting any stone that had shifted, clearing the small drainage channels he had cut along its uphill face. The wall was ready. It had been ready since the autumn of 1884. What was not ready was the swale. The swale ran across the hillside about 30 paces below the wall, a shallow natural depression that gathered runoff from the slope above and carried it east toward a stand of black willows. In an ordinary spring, the swale handled the melt without complaint. In a hard, fast thaw, the kind a Chinook could bring on in 48 hours, the swale would fill faster than it could drain, and the overflow would spill south down the open slope toward the village flats. Owen Thorne had understood that. The wall above the swale was meant to break the first hard push of water coming down off the bench, to slow it, to spread it across its length instead of letting it gather into a single channel. But the wall alone would not be enough. The swale itself had to be cleared, deepened where it had silted in over the winter, and the small notch at its eastern end, the notch Caleb had cut by hand 5 summers earlier, had to be opened back up so the water could spill cleanly off toward the willows and the lower draws instead of backing up against the wall. Caleb worked with the shovel and the iron hammer through the short March daylight. Roper lay on the bank above him, watching the slope below for movement. The Chinook was still pushing up the valley in slow, heavy waves. By midday, the snow along the south face of the swale had collapsed entirely, and the dark, wet earth underneath was beginning to soften enough to dig. Caleb cleared the silted sections one length at a time, throwing the wet soil up onto the downhill bank where it would not wash back in. He reopened the notch at the eastern end with a hammer, breaking up the frozen crust along its lip, and prying loose two heavy stones that had settled into the cut during the winter. By late afternoon, his hands were raw inside his gloves and his back had begun to seize between his shoulders. He stopped once to drink from the canteen and to chew a piece of dried venison while standing in the middle of the swale, looking up at the wall above him. From this angle the curve of it was clear. It ran across the slope exactly the way Owen had laid it out on the map, the long crescent of stone sitting directly above the long crescent of silty ground down on the flats. He thought about the storehouse. He thought about the 3 new cabins inside the old line. He thought about the children in those cabins. He went back to work. It was full dark by the time he finished. He climbed back up to the wall, walked its full length one more time with the lantern in his hand, checking the small drainage channels along its uphill face, making sure each one ran clean. He reset 2 stones along the top course where the frost had lifted them slightly. He cleared a packed wedge of old snow from the base of the wall near the swale's western end, where the first push of meltwater would come down hardest. When he finally turned back toward the cabin, the wind had shifted again. It was coming straight up out of the south now, warm enough that he could feel it through the wool of his coat. The stars were gone. A thin, high overcast had moved in across the valley, the kind that holds heat against the ground instead of letting it rise. Roper walked close beside him all the way back. The dog had not eaten much in 2 days. Caleb noticed it, but he did not coax him. There was no point pretending that either of them was going to sleep that night. The second warm night was worse than the first. By midnight, Caleb could hear water running everywhere on the slope around the cabin, under the snow, along the small ditches he had cut years ago to keep the spring path clear, down the rock face behind the woodpile. The dripping from the eaves had become a steady patter, like a light rain. The air smelled of wet bark and turned earth. He did not try to sleep. He sat at the table with the lantern turned low and the door cracked open so he could hear the valley, and he waited. It came a little after 3 in the morning. He heard it before he understood what he was hearing. A long, low groaning sound, deep and slow, coming up the slope from the direction of the river. Not a crack, not a snap. A groan, the way a heavy beam groans before it goes. Roper was on his feet at the door before Caleb was out of his chair. Caleb pulled on his coat and his boots and stepped outside with the lantern. The wind was still pushing warm up from the south. He walked out past the woodpile to the open ground above the timber and looked down at the valley. He could not see the river clearly from that height in the dark, but he could see the lights of Stoneberry Hollow, and he could see that something had changed about them. 2 of the lower windows that should have been dark were lit now. A third came on while he watched. Somebody down there had heard the groan too. Then the ice went. He heard it as a long, rolling crack that ran the length of the upper bend, followed by a deeper, heavier sound underneath it, the sound of water that had been held back for months finding a new way. The crack rolled out across the valley and came back as an echo off the far ridge. After that, for a long moment, there was nothing. No wind, no water. Just the silence of a river that had stopped being a river and become something else. Then the rush began. Caleb could not see it, but he could hear it, and he could feel it through the soles of his boots. The water was coming down off the upper bend and across the lower flats, taking the path of least resistance, taking the long crescent of pale silty ground that the river had taken before. He heard the sound of it hitting the storehouse, a high, splintering crash followed by the deeper rumble of timbers folding inward. He heard the sound of it hitting the lower fences along the wagon flats. He heard a hoarse scream once, somewhere down in the dark, and then go silent. Lights were coming on all across the village now. He could see them through the timber, lantern after lantern, window after window, doors flung open onto the porches. He could hear voices, faint at that distance, the way voices carry across cold water at night. Somewhere down there a bell began to ring. The meeting house bell. Caleb stood very still. Roper stood beside him, leaning his shoulder hard against Caleb's leg. The water was still coming. He could hear it spreading out across the lower flats, finding the cabins, finding the wagon yards. It would have taken the storehouse first because the storehouse sat lowest. It would have taken the 3 new cabins next because they sat directly across the old crescent. Beyond that, the ground rose slightly toward the meeting house and Hetty Marsh's store and the older homes along the upper street. Those would be safe for now. But the Chinook was still blowing. And above Stoneberry Hollow, up on the slope where Caleb was standing, the snowpack was beginning to give. He could hear it in the small sounds all around him, the trickle of meltwater running everywhere, the soft slumping noise of wet snow letting go from the south faces of the trees. In another hour, maybe 2, a second push of water was going to come down off the bench above the village, not from the river, from the slope itself, from the snowpack that had been building up there since November. If it came down the open slope, it would hit the upper street, the meeting house, the store, the older homes, everything the river had not already taken, unless the wall held it. Caleb turned and walked back to the cabin. He pulled on his heavy gloves, picked up the iron hammer, and called the dog. "Come on, Roper. We've got work yet." The walk down to the wall took less than 20 minutes, but it felt longer. The slope was already loosening under his boots in places. Twice he had to step around small slumps of wet snow that had let go from the trees and dropped onto the path. Roper ran ahead, then circled back, then ran ahead again, restless in a way Caleb had not seen the dog be in years. The wall came into view just as the first gray light began to lift behind the eastern ridge. Caleb walked its length once with the lantern, the way he had walked it the night before, but this time he was not looking at the stones. He was looking at the swale below it and at the long open slope above it. The swale was already taking water. A slow, steady runnel was moving along its bottom, draining east toward the willows through the notch he had reopened the day before. That was good. That was working. The first push of meltwater off the upper bench was being caught by the wall, spread along its uphill face, and steered down into the swale, and the swale was carrying it east instead of letting it pour south toward the village. But the slope above the wall was darker than it should have been. The snow up there had begun to slump in long, wet sheets. Caleb could see the shapes of them in the growing light, broad, shallow slides where the top crust had let go and started to creep downhill in slow, heavy waves. None of them had moved far yet, but they were moving. He set the lantern down on the top of the wall and got to work. He spent the next hour clearing the small drainage channels along the uphill face of the wall, the way he had cleared them the night before, but now with the water actually running through them. The channels were the part of the wall most people had never noticed. They were narrow cuts, no more than a hand's width, set every 10 paces along the wall's length, angled slightly downhill toward the swale. Owen had taught him that trick. A wall that tried to hold water back would eventually fail, but a wall that let water through in controlled places would stand. The channels turned the wall from a dam into a sieve. They let the meltwater move through it at the pace the swale below could handle, instead of letting it pile up against the uphill face until the pressure pushed stones loose. 2 of the channels had silted in during the night. Caleb cleared them with the hammer in his hands, prying loose the wedges of frozen mud and pulling them down to the swale. The water immediately found the cleared cuts and began running through them in thin, steady streams. The pressure along the uphill face of the wall eased visibly within minutes. He could see it in the way the small puddles along the base began to drop. He worked his way along the full length of the wall, checking each channel, clearing any that had begun to clog. By the time he reached the eastern end, the sky behind the ridge had lifted enough that he could see the valley below without the lantern. What he saw stopped him. The lower flats of Stoneberry Hollow were gone. The river had taken them. From this height in the gray light he could see the new channel the water had cut, a broad dark sweep across the old crescent, exactly along the line Owen had drawn on the map 30 years earlier. The storehouse was gone. 2 of the 3 new cabins were gone. He could see the third still standing in the middle of the flood, tilted hard to one side, its roof half collapsed. The wagon yards were gone. Most of the lower fences were gone. The upper street was still there. The meeting house, Hetty Marsh's store, the older cabins along the bench. The bell was still ringing. Caleb stood at the eastern end of the wall and looked down at it for a long moment. Then he looked back up at the slope above him. The wet snow up there was still moving. The first sheet of it had crept almost 100 yards downhill during the hour he had spent clearing the channels. It would reach the wall by mid-morning. When it did, the wall would either hold it, spread it across its length, and steer it into the swale, or it would not. He picked up the hammer and started back along the wall to check the channels again. The sheet of wet snow reached the wall a little after 9 in the morning. By then, the sky had cleared again and the sun had come out, which was the worst thing that could have happened. The Chinook had warmed the air all night. Now the sun was warming the snow directly. The sheet did not come down all at once. It came in slow, heavy lobes, the way wet snow always moves, not an avalanche, not a slide, but a creeping mass of saturated white that moved at the pace of a slow walk and weighed as much as a freight wagon. The first lobe hit the wall about 100 yards from its western end. Caleb was standing at the swale's notch when it happened. He felt the impact through the ground before he heard it, a soft, heavy thump, not loud, but deep enough that Roper flinched beside him. He ran along the swale to the point of impact. The wall was holding. The lobe of wet snow had piled up against the uphill face, 3 feet deep in places, and the meltwater pouring out of it had immediately found the drainage channels. Water was streaming through the cuts in steady ropes, running down into the swale, and the swale was carrying it east. The wall itself had not shifted. The top course was still level. The stones were still locked. He moved along the wall, checking each channel. A few of them had begun to clog with snow and broken bits of branch carried down by the slide. He cleared them with the hammer as he went. Water surged through each one the moment it opened. The second lobe hit about 20 minutes later, further east along the wall, near the half-buried square of older stonework at its terminus. This one was bigger. Caleb felt the ground shake under his boots, and he heard the deep, heavy sound of the snow piling up against the stone. He ran toward it. The wall held there too, but near the eastern terminus, one stone in the top course had been knocked slightly loose by the impact. He could see the gap in the line where it had shifted. If another lobe hit the same spot, the stone would go, and the gap would widen, and from there the wall could begin to fail along its eastern third. He climbed up onto the wall and reset the stone with the hammer. It took him almost 10 minutes, working with cold, raw hands, prying the stones around it slightly apart and dropping the loose one back into its bed, and tapping the surrounding stones back tight. Owen had taught him this work when he was 15 years old. He had not had to do it under pressure before. When he stepped back down, his hands were bleeding inside his gloves and his shoulders were shaking. Roper was standing at the foot of the wall with his ears up, looking east along the slope. Caleb followed the dog's gaze. A man was coming up through the timber, then a second man behind him, then a third. Caleb watched them come. He did not move from beside the wall. The hammer hung at his side. He waited. The first man to reach the wall was Tom Cobb, who ran the smithy at the upper end of Stoneberry's Main Street. Tom was a heavy man, broad-shouldered and slow-moving, and he was breathing hard by the time he reached the wall. His coat was wet to the chest. His boots were caked with mud and packed snow. He stopped about 10 paces from Caleb and stood there with his hands on his knees, getting his breath. The second man was Hetty Marsh's nephew, Edwin, a young man of perhaps 22 who had come west from Iowa the previous summer. The third was a wiry old trapper named Joss Brennan, who had lived in the valley longer than anyone except Hetty herself. Nobody said anything for a long moment. Tom Cobb looked at the wall. He looked at the swale below it. He looked at the channels running clean and steady through the stonework. He looked at the broad, dark line of wet snow piled up against the uphill face, and at the long, slumping sheets of snow still creeping down the slope above. He looked at Caleb. "It's holding," Tom said. "It's holding," Caleb answered. Joss Brennan, who had said almost nothing in any public meeting for 40 years, walked up to the wall and laid his hand flat against one of the stones in the top course. He stood there for a moment with his hand on the stone. Then he turned and looked at Tom Cobb. "We need every man in the village up here before noon," Joss said. There's more snow coming down." They came up the slope in twos and threes through the rest of the morning. Some of them carried shovels. Some of them carried nothing at all. Hetty Marsh came up around 11, riding the old gray mare she usually only used for trips to the depot at Plains, with Edwin walking beside the horse to steady her in the mud. Reverend Silas Burnham came up not long after, on foot, in the same long black coat he wore on Sundays, the hem of it now soaked black to the knee. Caleb did not stop working when they arrived. He had 3 channels to clear along the central section of the wall, where the heaviest lobe of wet snow was still settling against the stones. Tom Cobb and Joss Brennan worked beside him without being told. Edwin took the eastern end. 2 younger men whose names Caleb did not know took the western end. Nobody spoke much. The work was loud enough on its own, the scrape of shovels on packed snow, the chock of the hammer against stone, the rushing sound of meltwater pouring through the cleared channels. Hetty Marsh stayed up on the bench above the wall with the old mare. She watched the work without saying anything for a long time. Caleb did not look up at her. He could feel her there, the way a man feels weather coming. Reverend Burnham did not stay long. He walked the length of the wall once, slowly, with his hands clasped behind his back. He stopped at the half-buried square of older stonework at the eastern terminus and stood looking at it for a long moment. Then he turned around and walked back down the slope toward the village without speaking to anyone. Caleb watched him go. He did not feel anger watching him go, which surprised him a little. He had expected to. By mid-afternoon, the worst of the wet snow had moved. The big lobes had piled up against the wall, dumped their meltwater into the channels, and settled into low, dark heaps along the uphill face that were no longer creeping. The smaller slumps higher on the slope had stopped moving entirely as the sun began to drop and the air cooled. The slope was going to hold now. The wall had done what Owen had built it to do. Caleb sat down on the top course about halfway along the wall's length. His hands were shaking. He had not eaten since the night before. Roper came over and laid his head across Caleb's boot and did not move. Tom Cobb sat down beside him. The big smith pulled a strip of dried beef out of his coat pocket and handed it over without speaking. Caleb took it. He chewed slowly. Tom looked out across the valley. From the wall you could see the whole of Stoneberry Hollow. The lower flats were still gone. The river was still running through them in its new old channel, broad and dark and slower now that the first rush had passed. The storehouse was gone for good. Caleb could see broken timbers piled against the willows half a mile downstream. 2 of the 3 new cabins were gone. The third was still standing, tilted, half submerged. He could see 2 men with a rope working their way out to it across the shallow water. The upper street was untouched. The meeting house, the store, the older cabins, the bell had stopped ringing hours ago. "How many?" Caleb asked finally. Tom Cobb knew what he meant. He took a long breath before he answered. 2 so far, Tom said. The Hennessy boy, he was sleeping in the loft of the storehouse. His pa had given him the watch overnight. And old Pell from the cabin nearest the river couldn't get out in time. Caleb nodded slowly. He had known both of them. The Hennessy boy was 14. There would have been more, Tom said after a moment. A lot more if the wall hadn't held the slope. Caleb did not answer. He looked down at the new river running through what had been the wagon flats. He thought about the Hennessy boy. He thought about old Pell. He thought about Owen Thorne walking that crescent of silty ground with a pocket compass and a length of wax string 30 years earlier, marking a line that nobody in Stoneberry Hollow had been willing to read. Hetty Marsh came down from the bench then, leading the old mare by the reins. She stopped a few paces away from where Caleb and Tom were sitting on the wall. She did not say anything at first. She looked at Caleb. She looked at the wall. She looked at the long dark line of wet snow piled against its uphill face and at the channels still running clean. "I was wrong about you, Caleb Thorne," she said. She did not say it loud. She said it the way she said most things, quiet, even, without flourish. Then she turned the mare around and started walking back down toward the village. Caleb Thorne did not go back down into Stoneberry Hollow that day. He stayed on the wall until full dark, walking its length one more time, checking each channel, resetting 2 more stones in the top course that had been jarred slightly loose by the heaviest of the lobes. Tom Cobb and Joss Brennan stayed with him most of the afternoon. Edwin walked back down at sunset to help with the recovery work along the river. The others drifted away in 2s and 3s as the light failed. When the last of them was gone, Caleb sat on the top course of the wall with Roper at his feet and looked at the lights of the village coming on in the dusk. Fewer lights than the night before. Whole stretches of the lower flats were dark now, where lights had burned for years. But the upper street was still lit, the meeting house was still lit, Hetty Marsh's store was still lit, and most of the older cabins along the bench were still lit. The valley was not finished. He walked back up to Owen's cabin that night and slept for 14 hours without moving. In the weeks that followed, Stoneberry Hollow began the slow work of putting itself back together. The river had cut a new channel and was not going to give the old flats back. That was understood quickly. The new construction would have to be done on the upper bench, above the line Owen had drawn on the map 30 years earlier. Joss Brennan went up to the half-buried square of older stonework at the eastern end of the wall, walked the ground around it carefully for 2 full days, and came back down with the rough outline of where a new storehouse could be safely built. Nobody argued with him. Tom Cobb came up to the cabin in mid-April with a folded piece of paper signed by 23 men of the valley. The paper said that the council's vote of the previous month was withdrawn, and that Caleb Thorne was welcome in Stoneberry Hollow at his own pleasure, and that the village owed him a debt it would not pretend to be able to repay. Caleb read the paper through twice. He folded it carefully and put it in the tin chest with Owen's journal. He did not move back down into the village. He kept the cabin on the upper slope and went on with his trapping. But he came down to the store once a week now, and to the meeting house on most Sundays, and he stopped at the smithy when Tom Cobb's youngest daughter was born in May, and brought a small carved cradle that he had made over the winter from a piece of black walnut his Uncle Owen had set aside 40 years earlier and never used. Reverend Silas Burnham left the valley before the end of summer. He did not give a farewell sermon. He simply packed his trunk and rode out one morning on the stage to Plains, and a younger preacher arrived in October to take the pulpit, a soft-spoken man from St. Paul who had grown up on a farm and asked Caleb in his second week if he would walk the upper slope with him and show him what the wall was for. Caleb walked him along the full length of it. He showed him the channels. He showed him the swale. He showed him the half-buried square of older stonework at the eastern terminus, which turned out, when Joss Brennan dug into it carefully that summer, to be the foundation of a small dry stone shelter that Owen Thorne had built in the autumn of 1859, and then abandoned when the rancher Garner refused to listen to him. The young preacher stood looking at the foundation for a long time. Then he asked Caleb if he might bring his Sunday school class up to see it sometime, and Caleb said yes, and that was how the children of Stoneberry Hollow began climbing the slope to learn how to read the lay of the land instead of being told to fear it. By the end of the following decade, the wall had been extended twice more along the upper bench, and a second swale had been cut below it to catch the runoff from the new sections, and a small lookout cabin had been built at the eastern terminus where a man could sit through a warm March night and watch the river and listen for the groan of ice giving way at the upper bend. Hetty Marsh died in the winter of 1897, of a chest cold she caught riding home from a relief call up the valley. She left the store to Edwin, who ran it for the rest of his life. She left her late husband's watch to Caleb Thorne, with a note inside the case in her even, unhurried handwriting that said only, "For the man who built the wall, from the woman who once called it a fool's wall. I was wrong about a great many things. This is the one I most regret." Caleb kept the watch in the tin chest with Owen's journal and Tom Cobb's folded paper. He carried it once a year, on the anniversary of the night the river moved, when he walked the full length of the wall in the late dusk with Roper, and then with Roper's son after the old hound finally died, and then with Roper's grandson after that, until at last he walked it alone in the long March evenings of his old age, an old trapper on a high slope above a village that had finally learned to listen. The wall is still there. The valley still calls it Thorn's Wall now, though for a long time before that it had another name, and most of the people who used the old name are buried in the small cemetery on the upper bench, above the line. If you've made it this far, take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. These frontier stories take real care to research and tell, and your support is what keeps them coming. Leave a comment below and let us know what country you're watching from. We love seeing where these stories are reaching. And if a story like Caleb Thorne's moved you, share it with someone who needs to be reminded that the quiet, stubborn people who see what others refuse to see are often the ones who end up saving the rest of us. Until next time.